Nationalism. That's what I want to talk about. I'm not sure if this is going to be a game-playing episode at all now, so you can either jump forward a bit to see if you want to see the gameplay or not. But I wanted to talk about nationalism. And I think this is a good way. And I was thinking about starting this episode because I think it's sort of time to finish this series of, yes, Napoleon Total War. And that will be happening in episodes coming up for sure. But I wanted to talk about nationalism because, excuse me, the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, need to sort of say that way, but we'll just shorten it to the Napoleonic Wars because he was involved in the French Revolutionary stuff too, for sure. The Siege of Toulon, the French Revolutionary invasion of Italy. Most assuredly, he was involved with all of that. So, Wars of Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars, are what really cements nationalism in Europe. And that's a significant and important thing. Now, there's seeds of nationalism at some level. You know, I can think of the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, I think, in Scotland. And that was sort of the barons of Scotland declaring a sort of national identity, sort of to the Pope. So, we definitely see nationalism before this time period. Now, but as I say, these wars really, and nationalism is spread very much by the revolutionary fervor of the French revolutionaries. And they sort of caused their own trouble because they're spreading this nationalism and trying to spread the revolution, as it were. And to some degree, it sort of turns against them at times because, oops, maybe these people over here become nationalistic, but they're not French. So, you know, it does turn against them a bit. Some people, many people, see nationalism as a problem. And I don't mean this nationalism as in the nationalists of you know, the Spanish Civil War or some ultra-nationalist forces that were either around in the 1930s or around today. We're just talking about national identity. What in America it's generally called patriotism. But still nationalism, because it's slightly different between the American context and nationalism outside of the rest of the world, and we're not going to get into that significantly here today. Now, like I say, many people see nationalism as a problem. One of them in the past is like George Bernard Shaw and Marx, Engels, Marxism, Leninist Marxism. They are internationalists. They see nationalism as a negative thing. And if any of you are mistaken, those that promote, quote unquote, the European project, the EU, whatever you want to call it, they are anti-nationalists at their very core. Is that in and of itself a bad thing? Well, let's examine nationalism and what it is, and why there wasn't nationalism before I don't know, 1789, 1790 something, 1815, and it spreads, and it's at different points and times, hitting different places. So all of those dates can be real dates for it. Okay. Humanity lives within communities. And those communities have protocols, shall we say. How to greet people. You know, how to greet family, how to greet friends, how to greet community members that you recognize, how to greet strangers that you've never seen before. You know, we have protocols. And they vary. Now, there's similarities because we're all human. And that's sort of the internationalists want to, well, we're all human, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And so there's always going to be similarities. But so when your perspective is this valley, and I use valley with reason because you can normally stand, it can be a fairly big valley, and it can be a smallish valley, but when you stand up on a sort of someplace overlooking the valley, you can see your community. And there may be 2 or 3 towns within that community, and you know, that are 5, 10, 30 miles apart, depending on geography and whatnot. But you can see this as a community, and that is your perspective. People that moved around a lot, like soldiers, but also, say, we're sort of looking in the past, in the Middle Ages, Masons. Masons were, I'm not talking about Freemasons or something, but actual Masons. They're dependent on someone needing masonry skills. So you're building a church, maybe, but definitely something like a cathedral, a castle, something significant needing masonry skills. So when the castle or the cathedral is done, you don't want to stay in that town and try to eke out a living. Oh, you need a special arch for your fancy house there, sir? No, because that's going to keep you fed for a week, a month, whatever. Not a month. A mason's going to knock out an arch quicker than a month, you know, for somebody's home. That's going to keep you fed briefly, but it's not going to keep you fed a long time. So you're going to move to the next big project. And so there were people that were sort of internationalists. And yes, in the Middle Ages, not so much, I don't think, in the Dark Ages, just because it was the Dark Ages, but in the Middle Ages, yes, people did go on pilgrimage. Now, a lot of pilgrimages, the English would go on pilgrimages around England, or, you know, some other, you know, they weren't very, very, very minuscule percentage, even when the Holy Land, say, were controlled by the Christians, did people go all the way down to some place like that, or a pilgrimage even to, you know, from France down into Rome. It was more regional pilgrimages. So people did sort of see and go some other places, but really their perspective was the area that they could see and interact with. And so there was, shall we say, 2 cultures. And I really do sort of mean that. There were 2 cultures in any one area. There was and this is, we're talking late Middle Ages, but more into the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment. 2 cultures. One culture is the local culture. The other culture is the culture of the ruling class, because they have a different culture. Even if they grew up in that valley and speak that language and are sort of those people to a degree, because they read is the critical thing. They read, where most of the people don't read. And so the language that someone speaks, or the protocols of the next valley, don't matter to you, because you, as an individual, rarely interact with the people from the other valley. Sure, there'll be merchants that move around. They'll learn the different protocols in each of the valleys. Now, of course, if you're just wandering around, say, a place like France, you're mostly going to just encounter other French people. And I like to collect, and I have a bunch of, I collect maps. One map was just of I forget what it was, a word for something like pencil or something like that in France, in modern day France. And there's like 4 different words, 3 or 4 different words for like pencil or something. Now, of course, the main word that's used is, or whatever it was, I forget, it doesn't matter. Could be a bread or I don't know, something like that, something common that everyone would use. The main sort of accepted word is the word used in Paris and over about 60-70% of the country. But you look around, there's some regions that they use different words. We have some of that in some similar things like that in the U.S., but within English. But so so most people are speaking, so I love to collect maps and of all different types of things, and so word usage wouldn't, to a person who, in a modern day context today, if you use the other word for pencil or whatever in a different part of France, they'll probably know what you mean, but it marks you out as not one of us. You do that in the Middle Ages, they may have no clue. I want a big zebra. Zebra? What's a zebra? And if they've never heard of Africa, what's a zebra? Zebra, to write with. Oh, you mean a pencil? Oh, we call that a pencil. You call it a zebra? Whatever. Just meaning it would be a complete non sequitur to them. So, but a merchant would learn these kind of things. So, again, that's sort of and especially as you go on in more recent times, a merchant would be a person who reads and writes. So, nationalism is not really a factor because it really doesn't matter. And we can look at Belgium, modern day Belgium, and the Netherlands too, or Holland, everyone, because this is all sort of one, and originally all sort of basically one until the Protestant Reformation, in which you have the Protestants in the north and the Catholics in the south. But this is, of course, the Spanish Netherlands. And then, of course, they sort of go off, and then this is the Spanish Netherlands down here. And then it's the Austrian Netherlands. And to the local Dutch people, it doesn't matter. Because it matters on how well they're governed by their local whatever. And, it doesn't matter that they're part of the Habsburg Empire. When the Habsburgs ruled in Spain, it was called the Spanish Netherlands. Once they lost Spain, it was called the Austrian Netherlands because the Habsburgs were still ruling in the in Austria. And trust me, the Habsburgs at their core are anti-nationalist. I dealt with some correspondence many years ago, just a quick little letter back and forth with Otto Habsburg. I'm sure there's an heir today. He's, of course, passed on now, but and he was one of the I think it was, I don't know if he was at that time or whatever, a member of the early proto-EU Parliament kind of thing, commission. He very much was an internationalist and trying to bring Europe together. He was extremely an internationalist. So the Habsburgs are at their core internationalists. Just to bring into the modern set, that's one reason why Hitler hated the Habsburgs, is because Hitler was a vehement nationalist and he knew the Habsburgs were internationalists. And so he hated that idea or concept. And Hitler is definitely a case of the negative aspects of nationalism. Whatever you think about strong German nationalism, or strong French nationalism, strong Norwegian nationalism, or pick anything out you wish to. I'm not going to use the T word that the left likes to use, but he is an extremely bad case of nationalism gone wrong for many, many reasons. And that is part of why nationalism is so distasteful to many European rulers to this day. And so that they, whenever they see nationalism, they worry that it is another. They see what happens when Hitler's in power. But okay, so to get the rise of nationalism, you have French revolutionary and Napoleonic armies marching all around Europe, spreading their nationalism, but people are also realizing, okay, nationalism. And it's sort of like, a Marxist people's this, people's that, people's the other thing, People's Democratic Republic of whatever. For the people. Against the oppressors. Whatever that means. But, and use it as sloganeering. And the people, of course, notice, yeah, but you're not us. So the French army's marching around. And you can see that in places like Spain. And the Napoleonic generals and Napoleon himself just don't understand. Why are all these people so upset with us? We just removed their king and put a better king on their throne. When they sent Napoleon's brother Jerome down to be king of Spain and kidnapped Ferdinand, they just didn't get. Why were these people doing just the people, not the military, not the elites, just the people refusing to have good governance? Because let's face it, the French bureaucratic system that they were trying to place around there was often a better governance than previous, wherever this may be, local governance that, was often inefficient, often giving positions to, family members or supporters that may be incompetent but support the ruling elites to maintain support. So, you and antiquated systems that are holdovers, especially see this a lot in Spain, holdovers from, 10 generations before that are still being administered with no update, no improvement due to experience. I'm also avoiding the P word, because the P word has a lot of bad things going as well for it. So, now, you have the spread of the idea of nationalism, and then you also, in and around this time, and continuing on, because yes, you've had printed books for a few hundred years, but most people couldn't read, and you're getting more and more newspapers, and the French are definitely spreading the newspapers around even more than they already were before. So now you get this idea of a cultural identity called national that is common to a group of people. And so this is now a shared thing. Where before it was shared by, and we'll go back to it, this valley. Now it's shared by, well, how many people and where? Where is the border? What is the national boundaries? And we can see an example of, that in Italy with at this time, before the start of the whole, French Revolution, you have the Bourbons, which are their own sort of Bourbon kingdom down here that is related to the Bourbon kingdom in Spain and related to the Bourbon kingdom in France. You have another Bourbon kingdom that is sort of supported by both. I just don't know the details of all of it's going on, but it's sort of a counterweight to the Habsburgs, because the Habsburgs are either directly ruling parts of northern Italy or are supporting local governments, now sort of close to the Habsburgs, but isn't really ruled by them at all, as far as I know, is Venice. And Venice is sort of this sort of valley, not all the way up here, stretching up, but this sort of part here. But then a lot of islands and possessions along the Dalmatian coast. Corfu. Corfu is Venetian and never goes Ottoman, never, and goes Venetian basically until I think the British take it over for a brief period. During this period, maybe a few years after 1817 or 1811, but is actually sort of in a little independent state. And the British sort of run it as a protectorship until, of one format or another, until there's enough of Greece liberated from the rest of the Ottomans. So the more, and they have something of a unique culture, I understand, in Corfu, because they're never have the oppression or whatever of the Muslims over the Christians, and the various influences culturally of that. So, but they, although I think the local culture is generally Orthodox, of course they're ruled over by Catholics. The Venetians are Catholics. So you have lots of Austrian influences coming in here. Of course, you have the papal influence, the papal states as a political influence, in and around Rome, and then you have the Bourbons down here. So you get Garibaldi and his wars of liberation and unification. Some of it is definitely unification into the Italian state. Some of it is, by that time, really the only liberation from foreign or external ownership that you would see or think of it. Is against the Habsburgs again. Now, also a little unclear is just where is the Franco-Italian border supposed to be and whatnot. So that's going on. So you see the Italian unification, because they're realizing, hey, we're all a bunch of Italians. We're not Tuscans, Sicilians, Venetians, whatever. We're really more Italians as a group. And so what is mass media, is my hypothesis here, is coming about. And at this time, this time being the 19th century, is newspapers and secondarily books. And so you're getting that happening, and so you get this national identity happening. And so that allows it to happen. And we're going to ignore anything going on in the classical, the pre-fall of Western civilization, Rome and whatever else, because that's all wiped away. Whatever identities that may or may not existed, if you would describe them as nationalistic, if you would, that doesn't matter anymore. With the fall of Rome, the fall of the classical world, not just of Rome. And so, what happened to somebody in the east of France doesn't necessarily affect what's happening to somebody in the west of France. So there isn't really the idea of, or usefulness of, a national identity. Now, is nationalism a good or a bad thing? Well, until one guy got Trump derangement syndrome, Jonah Goldberg, we'll mention him. Well, we won't go into his Trump derangement syndrome, but and Trump derangement syndrome, folks, if you don't know, is the inability to critically look at Trump. You also have, I don't know what you would call it, but the Trump supporter. Anything that Trump does is good. The Trump derangement syndrome, and there may be a good term for the always supporting Trump. And it isn't just MAGA or whatever, Make America Great Again. because trust me, there's a lot of people that are on Trump's side that have critical thoughts of this or that Trump does. But Trump derangement syndrome is the inability to recognize and applause, clap your hands when he does something right. And some people, just everything, Trump says I found the cure for cancer. No, that cure doesn't work. So just anything that Trump does is bad. Now, I'm not saying you should love Trump. I'm not saying you should love Trump or whatever. That's not my point. My point is that you can't see when he does something good or does something right and give him credit for it. That's Trump derangement syndrome. There's people that are against Trump that don't have Trump derangement syndrome, and they realize when he does things good, they think he may do more things bad than good, or his bad things way outweigh his good things. But that's somebody that can look at it, rationally. And then, of course, there's Trump supporters like myself that'll go, yeah, no, that's stupid. And then a couple of days later it comes out, yeah, he corrects himself because he's just often just thinking off the top of his head and saying BS, which is not necessarily the best in presidents, but, that's Trump. And so, yeah, Trump doesn't always say or do things that are right or good. And I'll gladly and happily say that. But I generally think he's doing a better job than all the other people that would likely have the job at this time. But that doesn't mean he's perfect or he's always doing the best or anything like that. So, yes. Jonah Goldberg described nationalism as salt. Without any salt, a human will die, or most mammals will die. You need some salt in your diet. A little more salt in your diet is good. It makes things taste, particularly good. Brings out the taste. You want to put salt on things. So salt, a little bit more, is good. Too much salt is unhealthy for you. You can get, if you have too much salt in your diet, it's unhealthy. And then an extreme amount of salt in and of itself will just kill you. It'll be a poison to you, literally. You can poison somebody. If you jam enough salt into their body, it'll kill you. And that's sort of nationalism. It gets back to, the National Socialist and Hitler. They were definitely the kill you type nationalism. So nationalism, and why is nationalism good for you? And it gets back to a degree to your perspective, the proverbial valley that you can see. If that's your world, that's your world. And what happens in the other valley, or especially valleys on the other side of the world, doesn't really affect you. If most everything that you eat. Now, sometimes you may be, importing wool or importing something that just isn't local, but it's not, if you don't get it for a few years, let's say you need to import wool for your clothing or something. If you don't get clothes for a few years, the way the Middle Ages worked, you could probably just be just fine. You'll be looking a little ragged after a few years because they weren't necessarily getting new clothes every, few months. So it would just sort of be a little bit of a halt, a little bit of a hardship. But most everything like essential, is coming out of, food, basic construction materials, were coming out of your valley. You weren't importing a lot of that. So your basic minimal needs were coming out of your valley. Now our perspective, and you're listening to me, watching this video, is global. And I'm sure some of my socks that I wear are made in China, though I understand a lot of that kind of stuff is moved to Bangladesh, as China got more expensive to make this type of cheap clothing in China. Got a lot of it moved to Bangladesh. And so products, basic staple products And I was horrified to find out that most all American medicine is made in China, even by companies that are supposedly American companies. They've moved all their manufacturing to China. And it's not that it's China that horrifies me, is that it's external and a single source. That is a problem. But back to perspectives. Yes, I can see the world. I can get on the internet and literally see live television feeds from all over the world, like Deutsche Welle. I think that's it. DW. I have bookmarked the English broadcast of that, so I can watch that, or the BBC, or whatever. I can see live television broadcasts from all over the world on the internet. Now, should that be internationalism and globalism? Well, some people, either in their mistaken view of humanity or in their desire to have a post-cultural world, if you will, think it's a good idea. But human cultural identity is an important thing. And every culture is unique, but not every culture, quote unquote, deserves to exist forever. Because there are bad cultures. Now, that doesn't mean any one culture is entirely bad. It just means that there are bad cultures out there. Other cultures are work better. And so cultures need to develop over time, but they don't need to be a single thing. And so the protocols on how to do things will vary between different groups of people. And so we could go back to the EU and the European project. Is it a bad thing? And this video is not about EU bad, nationalism good. No, this isn't that. This is a look at the idea of nationalism, which is much bigger and more extensive than just Europe and Europe's situation. But okay, how do I... If you look at the Habsburg dynasty, like I say, they were internationalists, and most leaders, kings, aristocrats, doges in Venice, or other sorts of... You still had some sorts of types of republics, though they weren't generally democratic republics, and that people voted, the common person voted. In Italy, and you can look at whether you're I'm sort of staying out of the Dark Ages. I'm looking at more of the Middle Ages through the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment. Those most of those leaders were not nationalists. You can look at the what's it called? I'm gonna keep blanking on these names. Oh man, what? close below if you... No, I'm going to skip over it. Plantagenet, that's it. You can look at the Plantagenets, Richard III, Richard de la Cour, Richard the Lionheart, and his brother, later, King John of England. We in the English-speaking world think of them as English kings. King John more so, just because of things. But where Richard III didn't really like England, didn't hang out in England much. He was either off crusading in the Crusades or running around his, what we would call them today, French possessions. He's killed assaulting a castle. I think it was down around here. They were sort of besieging a castle, and somebody shot a crossbow out and hit him in the neck, and he died a few days later. They're looking at their possessions in Aquitaine as much as they are looking at their possessions in England. And they're Normans, and so they're probably speaking more French than English, though I think the Plantagenets also, the monarchs also spoke English, I think. And so we have here is, this sort of international ruling elite. Now, if you think the faceless EU bureaucrat or the EU elected officials in their European Parliament or whatever don't have as much desire to rule or govern or whatever you want to call it as a medieval monarch, that they aren't just as hungry for the power as a medieval monarch, you are sadly mistaken. Oh, but they just want to do good and be good bureaucrats and make society better. Well, probably most of the ruling classes, and I want to say it that way is because, like France prior to Louis XIV, was mostly run through the aristocrats. Often the French kings controlled, or they may have been sort of the biggest, have been the biggest sort of aristocrat ruling directly over more land than any one of the other aristocrats. But the power base was set up for, Duc de whatever, around France. And so it wasn't until Louis XIV and building Versailles that really tried to centralize governance in France. Probably most of the ruling class, which whether it means a king or aristocrat or whatever, was actually trying to do good. Or at least he saw himself. Yes, it is mostly. You do have some women that are not just behind the throne type ruling, but direct ruling as well. There are some of that, but mostly it's men, of course. Most of them thought that they were trying to do good whether for their religion, for the souls of their people, or for the economic influences, or for their safety and security. Sure, kings, whatever, aristocrats, wanted a nice palace. So sure, they wanted, to squeeze money out of the economy. Not necessarily always out of the peasant, but out of the economy, to be able to afford a nice house, nice clothes, nice whatever. But then a lot of what they want, the money, beyond that, especially a king, what else does he need money for? His defense, his army, his navy. And so they will often see that as protecting the people's lives. It may make them miserable that you're taxing them or something, but hey, they're safe because you have a bigger army. It's just like, hey, Luxembourg. Yeah, how's that going for you, Luxembourg, in defending yourself? Well, in the 20th century, and two wars that sort of mattered, didn't go so well. You didn't quite, weren't quite able to defend a little bit more territory means a little bit more taxes, which means a little bigger army, a little bit more. And so you always have this. And this is the way you have with the EU bureaucrat or politician, in that, let's hold on to Britain, let's not let it go, or let's expand it into this country or that country because we'll get a little larger tax base and they'll be more part of this integrated system. We're just doing it for their good. We are the good. And the problem with that is, and I'm not saying national politicians are any different. God, no. I'm not suggesting that. And yes, I know in the media it's often slamming the religious politician as being a hypocrite. Well, all humans are hypocrites. So I don't know that the religious politician is any likely more to be a hypocrite than the non-religious politicians. But, they just, use sort of God as their weapon, and people get upset by that who don't either agree with their version of God or don't like the idea of God or religion or whatever. So they slam them, but all of the politicians are equally hypocritical. I mean, all humans are hypocritical at some level. Now, some are major hypocrites, some are minor hypocrites. But even those that are trying to look out, whether it's for the children or for your soul or for whatever, and this can be for, I'm focusing on Western society because I know it best because I'm a member of it. But this can also be for Iran, for China, for whatever, This is not just focused on Europe. And so in a place like Iran, not that the ruling elite doesn't want them to do economically well, but ultimately they don't care about that. They care about the people's immortal souls and doing what they think God wants them to do for their souls. And so they believe they are right, and so they're going to do what they think God wants them to do. And maybe they have God's vision right, and the rest of us are just all wrong, and they're all right and we're all wrong. But I don't think so. And so, like I was saying, so national politicians are hungry for power. Some of them have an ideology, and ideologies often come to mean, because of Marxism, an economic ideology, which is economic. Who owns, whether it owns property or owns the clothes on your back, who owns it? Does the state own it? Does the individual own it? Who owns what is economic ideology. But ideology is much, much bigger than that, including the idea of nationalism is part of ideology. Ideology is, belief. And so, it can be religious, it can be cultural ideologies, it can be the ideologies of freedom, of protection, of security, which is sort of freedom or sort of protection, but security can also be economic security, not just like, we have a big army to protect ourselves and lots of policemen on every corner, so that somebody cries out rape, he immediately runs over to see if there's really a rape or somebody just, making a claim of it, so he's immediately there. There's the physical protection, but then there's security as the idea, I'm guaranteed a place to live, I'm guaranteed medical coverage, I'm guaranteed all these things, as well as a police and an army for that, but economic security. But so you have ideology of what's going on. So some people want the power to spread their ideology. Could be to spread their religion. And again, I can mean this in the American politician, and we definitely still have them, like Mike Pence, our vice president, but they have definitely adjusted themselves from when I literally knew some of them back in the 80s, where they wanted to make laws against things. Now they are wanting to, at least in the US here, as opposed to someplace like Iran, wanting to, and they've seen the mistakes, I think, most of them. There's always exceptions, but somebody like Mike Pence, he doesn't want to make religious laws. Now, he wants to protect religious groups, religious organizations from government intrusion, but he wants to lead by example. At least that's how I read him. He is not the type of religious person that is going to force everybody into church on Sunday if he just had the power to do it. Partly because Mike Pence, I'm sure, has his own particular Christian viewpoint. I don't know. I know it's Protestant. Beyond that, I don't know. But even the Protestant religion is fractured here. So it's not like they're trying to do some religious state here, but they might want to say, lead by example and shun the people that don't follow the examples. But that's different than making laws. So yes, we still have those that are pushing from a religious viewpoint. So some people are looking for a particular and want that power for pushing a particular ideology. Some people, sometimes called centrists, but that's sort of a misnomer because that often may have a particular ideology, but it's sort of in the center of the right and left, but we'll call them pragmatists. They just want to do what they see is the good, whatever that may mean. And it can vary from place to place. Provide general stability, because it's only ideologist types that want to form a revolution unless the current system is near intolerable. And trust me, in most Western countries, the political system is not intolerable. Now, we can talk about certain immigrant communities to certain countries, often in places like Europe, that may be importing intolerance to tolerance. But most of the Western countries, and you can maybe correct me if I'm wrong somewhere, but even places in Hungary, I know the leadership there is, assume some semi-dictatorial powers, but most of it is not an intolerable situation that you need a revolution to solve. So most of the revolutionaries, because we are having an insurgency that's revolutionary currently in America, and I think it's died down in mostly just spread to the Anglosphere. Briefly some stuff I think in Germany and France, but for a while it was going on in England, and I don't know that it still is. But please update me if there's the current true riots, and I know there was the Yellow Vest movement, which whether it's continuing in France or not. I am aware of that as well. But I'm talking about the current leftist insurgency in America. Those are the people that are pushing it still to this day. And most of the quote-unquote protesters, some are truly peaceful, many of them are rioters, but most of them are pushing an ideology. They are pushing for a particular ideology. They're not pragmatists. So there are a bunch of pragmatists out there that are they want power. Oh, they want power. I'm not going to they want power. And I wouldn't even say, I don't, of course, sure, I love power. I'm not saying wanting power isn't in of itself a bad thing. It is a human thing. We can go back to it's sort of like salt. Having no power in your life, being sort of a prisoner or a slave, is really bad for you. Maybe being a complete and total powerful corrupts, ultimately, and ultimate power corrupts ultimately, or something. It could be, really bad for you. But, so we have to recognize that. But there are pragmatists that are just looking for what they see are solutions within their cultural viewpoint. And this gets back to nationalism. And I haven't lost that, my train of thought here. And so what we can look at two different communities, and they're actually quite different, but Japan and China, between their two different nationalisms, or national identities, not nationalisms, but national identities that are closer to each other than, say, they are to Western culture, for sure, but they are quite distinct and different. And one is not a copy of the other, even though the idea of Buddhism, which is an Indian idea that traveled out more or less through Tibet into China and then finally into Japan. But Japan has very little outside influences until the 19th century, late 19th century. And so Confucianism, a little bit in Japan, but not a lot. And they have much higher, both China and Japan have much higher levels of conformity to the community than we have in most Western societies. And is their way wrong and the Western way right as an absolute? Or is the Western way right and their way wrong? Well, strong ideologies would say yes or no to one side or the other, and then feel they need to impose that upon the world. So, an internationalist, again, one of the major internationalist groups out in the world, is socialism. And of course, extreme socialism is communism, but it's all socialism. It's just where, to some degree, where you think the lines should be drawn as to the ownership of property. So a socialist wants to spread socialism everywhere. If it is good for us in France, it must be good for those out in Vietnam and China and Polynesia and Bangladesh and Chile. Everywhere must be socialist. We must liberate the whole world for socialism. We cannot tolerate the idea of part of the world not being socialist. And that is the basic, that's Fabian socialism. They're Fabian socialists, which Tony Blair was a member of the Fabian Society in England. Fabian socialism comes out of, yes, England. And it is not a revolutionary socialism. They do not want to set up guillotines and hack people's heads off, but their symbol is a wolf in sheep's clothing. They want to do it through progress. And so it's not a revolutionary socialism that you see in, Marxist Leninism, because they are Marxist. Socialists are Marxists. But Marxist Leninism or Maoism or other sorts of, yay, the revolution's here, let's, chop off the heads or shoot the criminal elites, or in Mao's case, yeah, they did all that too. I don't know if they used the guillotine, but, well, they chopped people's heads off, yes. The swords and things in China. But, their struggle sessions, get everybody to admit that they're all, one level or another, sinners against the populace, and just admit their sins and struggle it through. Like, oh, that sounds a lot like the struggle sessions going on in America right now. Yes, the main intersectionalists, those that use the T word, toxic masculinity, toxic nationalism, toxic this, they are Maoists at their core. They are Maoist. They can put all their little writings in a little red book. All of this intersectionalism, this racial identityism, that is all coming. I mean, Mao, because he was there are different race, if you will. I don't want to get into genetics too much because I'm not a geneticist, but the Han Chinese are the majority peoples, and to a European, a lot of the other ethnic groups there may look similar. We may not know the distinctions. I don't know how genetically distinct they are, but there are more than just cultural differences. And some of these culture groups are within what we all consider China. And there are sort of little pockets of them, but the little pockets, there may be 10 or 20 million people in that little pocket. That's some other cultural group. And they're as different, shall we say, as French are to Germans. But we're all Europeans. Well, okay, maybe. And that's what China wants to sort of label themselves, Chinese identity. And they mainly express it as the Han Chinese. Now, the Manchus are up in Manchukuo or Manchuria, but they're different. So are the Mongols. They're different. And I understand genetically as well as culturally. They're not just, Hans on horses. Mongols aren't just Hans on horses. They are, I understand, their own genetic grouping. I sort of like to use the term genetics because genetic groups, because it has it doesn't have as bad or stereotypical terms that race does, that has been used and misused and abused. So different genetic groupings over in China, but it is the Han Chinese that are the main cultural group. And to one degree, we outside of them at least will call the people inside of that country, whether we want to say Tibet is part of it or not, but that would be another different genetic grouping to my understanding. Now they may, I don't know, all of these different groups that I've just been mentioning in China may all have a common ancestry. I mean, other than the idea that all, whether you go back to Adam and Eve or just the first genetic humans to evolve, as distinct from Neanderthals, which, yes, they supposedly have identified Neanderthal genes in some humans, so they interbred, but they are different species, which is more than just race or whatever. But yeah, and I don't know. I'm not an expert. And I don't know how all that works. That's not the point of this. But whether whether they all share a common starting point or they have multiple ones, I don't know. But it's this sort of national identity, and nationalism, and that. And so I don't want the world to be socialistic. I am not trying to get the world to be capitalistic. I would have less problems with socialism if it didn't have this connection to at its core of an ideology that it must be spread everywhere, that it is Marxist in its viewpoint, in that, and you have to understand, when I say Marxist in its viewpoint, you have to understand Marx's his views of history, which are god-awful wrong, and it's infected just about all of historical thought, including my own historical thought. But he's god-awfully wrong. You just read enough history books and you can start seeing the Marxism in it, but as a reader of it, do you realize what parts are Marxist? Now, it doesn't mean everything that Marx ever said was wrong, but his basic thesis and ideas are just so wrong. So I am not a universalist. If you are not a universalist, then I am a culturalist. I look at large groups. Individuals are individuals. I look at large groups of people as a cultural grouping. This may come from my Americanism, in that I am not concerned about someone's ancient DNA sources or their recent DNA sources as being as being a significant factor in themselves. I see culture as that, and I'm a culturalist, not a racist, a culturalist. Some cultures, observably, are more effective than other cultures. And when I say observably more effective, we can see their sort of success rate over being dominated by other cultures, and either have disappeared or are disappearing. And some of that can touch to even, shall we say, my interest of saying the Celtic cultures that live at the fringes of Europe that I would like preserved, but they're not seemingly as effective as the Anglo-Saxon culture, which is definitely influenced by Celtic influences, most assuredly, and also Norman influences, which are both well, not just Norway, but Norse, call it Norse influence as well as French influences. So, it gets multiple influences in Anglo-Saxon culture. And so some cultures are fading, some cultures are vibrant, and so these cultures are more or less effective. Now, maybe people in the Celtic culture are just so much more happy than people, and this is what often modern day academics and other sorts of people will often look at happiness indexes. Well, unfortunately, the world isn't just happy, happy, joy, joy. Don't know if any of you get that reference, but that if you're ineffective, if you're all just hanging out and being happy, yeah, you do a certain level of work to make sure you're clothed and you're fed and whatever else. But some other group of people may just decide, hey, that's a nice valley you live in. I think it's going to be ours. And whether they come riding over the hills and on horses or in tanks or whatever it might be in the future, they might just decide to take it from you. And so happiness is great. I hope for a lot of it for myself and people generally. But you have other measurements of effectiveness for cultures. And so, if we look at, I know I'm not an expert on it, but shall we say Polynesian culture, those people living out in the Pacific Islands, well, I think it sort of went wrong on Easter Island from what little we know of it. But a lot of it has a lot of sort of happiness, and though there are, you can look at some of the histories, what little we know of of like Hawaiian history before the Europeans show up. There were definite tyrants in one island group, and from one island invading another island and whatnot. But let's just sort of presume that there's a lot of happy people out there, and they're reasonably effectively using the resources they have, which don't have things like iron and whatnot, as part of their product, or part of their capabilities. But there wasn't necessarily any big impetus to make advancements in technology just because it was sort of satisfactory, and it might maximize happiness, but when it impacts with the rest of the world, shows up. So Polynesian culture, because we're not going to be one cultural, I know the internationalists might want to make us, but we're not going to be one cultural group. Other cultures may show up, so Polynesian culture may be a wonderful thing, but may not be a successful thing on its own. So national identities, get back to that, are good because they allow you to identify a group of people that have the same protocols, maybe in some ways also the same values. What's more important? How much free time you have, say in France, or how much how much money you can earn. Maybe that might be, I don't know if that would be Germany or if that would be the US. So France wants to drop down and have, say, 30-hour work weeks, and America wants to have 44-hour work weeks for success. It's 40 hours is the standard, but work an extra, whether paid or unpaid, work an extra 4 hours a week to make sure that you're, working hard, improving things, getting things going better, and being industrious, shall we say, or whatever. What's the more, is your leisure time, personal satisfaction leisure time, or is it spending all your time at work? What is better? Well, we have different experiments. And that's part of it, is the different experiments. And so we have a grouping of people, say French. They're going to have their protocols, which, again, do you shake somebody's hand? I know in the pre-COVID world, that was a quite common greeting, as well as a quite common thank you, end of a meeting, shake everybody's hand if everything went well. French, or at least in American's term, I don't know how common it would be for more so, I gather, family members you haven't seen, but kiss each other's cheeks kind of thing, as sort of a more warm hug, kiss, whatever, son, kiss cheeks, that you might have more expression in France that we don't have. Those are protocols. And then values. Do you value your free time, or do you value your work time more? What are your values? Like in China, they don't value free time. Sure, they go on vacation. Sure, they have some free time. Sure, they have particular holidays. It's sort of part of the coronavirus spread is that sort of broke out when everyone was sort of back home in Wuhan or wherever, and then sort of like the idea, like in the West, home for Christmas, go sort of to your cultural home for Christmas, hang out with your family, and then because it was sort of around Chinese New Year, I gather. And so, yeah, they do have that, but it's hours, 10-hour days, 12-hour days, work. In China, work a second job if you only have an 8-hour day. It's work, because they want economic security because of various long-standing Chinese values, as well as going through the Cultural Revolution and seeing the insecurities of not having finances to buy food or whatever it may be. So they see striving for economic security in and of itself a high value over personal leisure time. And I think to a degree in Europe, including Europe, even the World War II generation, I mean, they went through the trauma of World War II and all that in Europe, but there wasn't a lot of, say, famines. There were some sort of in the Netherlands during World War II, but there wasn't a lot of huge devastations because of a lack of economic security. Like China right now, I understand, is having massive amounts of floods going on. And so if your car is parked in an area that just got flooded, I don't know that they have auto insurance just to replace the car like we might have in America. If your car is in a flood zone and gets flooded, a hurricane hits or something, your auto insurance pays for it and you get a new car. And yes, you have to pay a little more for that auto insurance in that area to deal with it, but you just said, I think they're just sort of help the car because the car may be ruined and just needs to be basically scrapped. I don't know how it works there. And again, before modern transportation, as I said earlier, buying socks, whether made in Bangladesh or in China, something very cheap like that, shipped around the world, before you had that kind of ready shipping that can ship food around the world, if you're in China, and that's also often brought down dynasties, and China was the floods in some rivers, which happened in major rivers that happened at times, that can just mean that whole populace is wiped out because they don't have any food, even if, they get out of the floodwaters. And some will survive, yes, but even if most of the population get, it's not like a flood that it's a tidal wave and we all die. It's just right, the breaks, it's riverbanks. Yes, some people die, most people live, but if your whole crops are just gone, well, the other valley over there, or 3 valleys away or whatever, they're not just growing enough extra food to feed themselves and you. So yeah, a lot of your people die because of lack of food. And so China has this different traditions, shall we say, than Europe, with its interconnectivities shipping around the world, that if you were to have, say, all of the crops fail in France has enough economic wherewithal to buy food, whether it's from South America, the US, or somewhere else, to make up its complete lack of food. And most, there may be, if it happened immediately without any watching it coming, there may be people dying briefly just because it takes a while for the food to show up. But give it a few weeks, food will be arriving. And even in the short term, from neighboring nations, sending in canned or preserved food of some sort, enough to keep most people alive. And this is just like saying if there was a blight, like that killed all of the, potato blight. I'm thinking of like in Ireland or something, but something that massively hits France. The society is just going to find a way to survive because it's a first world country. And so imperative needs of the Chinese culture versus the needs of the French culture are not the same. And so when you have bureaucrats trying to impose, or rulers, if we want to say it, whether they're bureaucratic rulers or other, trying to impose their protocols and their values on, say, the Dutch, the French putting it on the Dutch, that has a bad result in one fashion or another. Now, cultures, like I say, will succeed and fail, and cultures will be spread sometimes through migration, but also through media, and things will change over time. And that is a good thing, that things change over time, but it's a good when, say, the Dutch decide to adopt something. It is bad when either the international bureaucrat has decided that most Europeans kiss each other on the cheek when they meet, so they are forcibly, when they meet a Dutch person, forcibly kissing them on the cheek. Maybe the Dutch like to do that too, I don't know. Don't think they do, but forcing that on the Dutch, and the Dutch don't want that to happen. Or forcing fewer work hours on the Dutch than, say, the French do. Or the Nazis coming in and trying to impose German culture on what they see as a fellow racial group or whatever of the Dutch, and are trying to absorb them into Germany. That is when it's a bad thing. So whether you are an ultra-nationalist and trying to violently, at whatever level of violence, whether it's world wars and complete military invasions, or just street thuggery, trying to impose your culture on others because you're ultra-nationalistic, or if you are internationalist at one level or another, trying to do the same thing from the other direction, it is bad. So this series has covered the rise of nationalism. And that, like I say, nationalism is because your perspective changes. You're now getting news, newspapers, eventually radio programs, television programs, and then moving into the internet, which is a mix of, is this a podcast? Well, more or less, actually, right now, because we're just sort of looking at a game and hearing me talk. So this is more of a radio with a little bit of pictures. Maybe you've been watching, so as I have been. These three wagons here, I've sort of been watching them. They go back and forth to here. These three wagons. Sort of radio with a little bit of entertaining picture. If you will, a podcast, radio, whatever you want to call it. Going back and forth, and we can see the level of road differences here. That's supposing trade or some sort of elements there going on. But so you're getting your mass media and your perspective has enlarged out, and you're seeing that we as a group of people need to, what's the extent of the people that have the same or similar, closely similar, depends on variations, similar values and similar protocols, because both are they're intertwined, because in a culture, language is an expression of culture. It isn't just a protocol of communication, but the meanings and the understandings. This is why I often use language, like effective when we're talking culture, and being able to what's the word I'm looking for? Not absolute. The opposite of relative. Well, is it absolute? Oh boy, I'm missing my language use here. The idea of, is a culture good or bad? Well, that is something that is open to discussion, because some cultures, or some, what is good and what is bad, but as an observable value or an observable effect is how effective a culture is say its wealth, its relative wealth to other parts of the world. And how does it, can the nation import socks from around the world without worrying about that? Because I'll tell you, sure as hell, people in Bangladesh, the common person is not really importing anything from America. Change my mind, the thing. Prove me wrong. What now? You go, oh, well, I bought a computer. Well, or that may have been made in not in America, but may have been made in Taiwan or China or something. Yeah, but is that the common person in Bangladesh? And now phones, which is a computer, obviously the phone, the tablet, those are computers, but we're talking about a bigger desktop thing. Yeah, but we see the level of how disposable some of these items are. And, you get the point. The people in Bangladesh don't make very much money. They may have a few items that are imported from a first world type country, whether that's a place like Japan or Taiwan, or there is still a little bit of the second world, and that would be places like China. For those of you who don't know, and I forget one recent, yeah, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to say who. Where's the second world, and can I go there? Because I think, and it was a she, I think there's the first world and there's the third world. Well, the second world was the communist bloc, which of course was sort of Warsaw Pact nations and sort of throwing in China. So China is still, and if you look at China as a whole, it is still a second world nation. It is not a first world nation like, say, Japan or Taiwan are first world nations. Hong Kong would be a first world territory now within China. And so, yeah, many people in China not necessarily do, can afford to have a few items, say, imported from America or from Europe. but they don't exist upon that kind of stuff as a normal thing like an automobile. Most all automobiles in China are made locally, sometimes almost complete rip-offs of outside cars, but it's only the sort of super elites that it's only sort of the elite class to one degree or another in China that have automobiles. So that's why I'm saying super elites. Now there's sort of the super elites that have, mega rich, but sort of the elites that might have a Mercedes or an Audi that's imported from somewhere else in the world outside of China. But if a German decides that they want an inferior car or whatever that they might think it is, they can easily afford a car not made in Germany. If they wish to. That is not might be something to be worked for, but it's not a difficulty for the average German. So you get the example. So, nationalism grows, to summarize, nationalism grows because your perspective gets larger than your immediate experience, looking across your valley. And it's very much because of this war with ultra-nationalists, being the French at the time, marching around the world with their ultra-nationalism, sort of makes you go, oh, wow, what other valleys share my protocols and my values? Oh, all these valleys, and we'll call it Italy, because I don't think that was a common term. I don't know. What would they refer to themselves? I don't know what they would have referred to themselves much prior to this time period. But whatever it is, I'm not quite sure that they would have referred to themselves. But okay, we're all Italians because we all speak a version of Italian. And so, so we all have similar shared values and protocols. Yes, I know Northern Italy is different than Southern Italy and whatnot, but it's all close enough. And so we need to band together all of those people that share our values in a group to continue to function. And that is why nationalism is important. That's why it comes about, because of the violence of the Napoleonic Wars. And so they get all of that put together. And that is a good thing, because beyond would it be boring if all humanity had the same culture, you have the idea of stagnation. If all humanity agrees upon one culture, what examples are they going to look at? And I'll use this sort of last example here coming in a moment, that things could be better or could be worse than what we're currently doing. You often say here in America, the government doesn't do things very well, because we can always see, private hospitals work better than public hospitals. Private industry works better than government industry. It always works better. The only thing that governments do well are armies. Well, that's because you've not seen private armies doing things. Would they be better? And so we've had some sort of, mostly they're not armies. Very, very few. The idea of the mercenary really is still sort of not allowed. You have the contractor, which is more of a, at least mostly, I sort of think of some of the Russians, but are mostly in the idea of protective services. They're not fighting the battles, mostly. They are, escorting supply convoys, securing compounds, whatnot. They're not really, the mercenary of the 1960s that was a European primarily, so white, military force fighting in African wars, or the 18th century mercenaries that were raised whether from one country or from all over the place, and then goes just serving off in some other nation as a pure military unit. But if we were to do pure private militaries, we might see private militaries working better than government militaries. But so we need to have different cultures, different cultural groups, and they can look at, and this is going to be entirely fictitious, but you know how the Belgian government has its what we call in America meter maids, people that run around and check, used to be and still is, the parking meter. You put some money in to park somewhere. Parking control in Belgium is entirely government controlled, and so they're all government. The people that run around are all in America, they're sort of a subset of the police, so they don't carry guns and they don't have any other law enforcement, but they normally have some sort of policing badge kind of thing. But all they're allowed to do is write parking tickets, not even moving violations, just parking tickets. They're all government controlled in Belgium, but in the Netherlands, it's multiple private companies that get contracts for places, and they can, write tickets, and to prove it, when they write the ticket, they also have to take, modern day world, have to take a quick snapshot with their smartphone to sort of prove it. So it's not just their word versus whatever else, and which works better. I don't know that either of them have meter maids, that type of thing, or my guess is they would both be government officials. But to say one is run, and we're talking similar scale governments, one is run by different private companies that compete with each other for different contracts based upon accuracy, based upon revenue generation, based upon how often are people illegally parked versus whatever happens in Belgium or something like that. So you have a comparative viewpoint, and maybe it doesn't matter for Denmark whether one of these or the other is more successful. They just believe that no matter which is more successful, that has to be a government thing, because to have it to be a company contract thing is just wrong, is just evil, is just I don't know what, but just another similar sort of scale of country. So it doesn't matter looking at both of these, because they're going to do it their way because of their culture. And that ain't going to change because, I don't know, doesn't matter what the reason might be. But just that idea. So nationalism is necessary for modern humanity. A globally connected humanity. Nationalism is really a necessary thing for humanity to flourish, because we have to do different things differently in different regions. Sometimes it's because it's effing cold in Scandinavia and goddamn hot in Brazil, so they got to do things differently. I'm thinking, I don't know if in Brazil they have siesta time or not, but I know in some of the Latin countries it's sort of like, from noon to 3 we all shut down, take naps, and then we all wake up, but we're open till that open back up. All the businesses and stores are open till 8 at night or something, and so we don't work in. The stores aren't open any more hours. They just shut down in the middle of the day because it's effing hot. Where in Norway, we at 8 at night we want to be out in summertime out in the sun, because in wintertime it gets dark long before then, and we don't want to be out working at our business at 8 at night, because it's going to be dark and whatever, and we it's not, people aren't going to be out. And in the summertime, since we're yay free sun, wonderful, we're going to so we're going to work in the middle of the day and then have the evening to go be out and about in sunshine. So we're going to do things different from different parts of the world. And let's just go Ecuador, they do everything in the middle of the day because they've air conditioned everywhere inside the country, and they have inside shopping mall And people, that's sort of like Las Vegas, actually, if you don't know. Las Vegas is a place of air conditioning that you maybe if you have your car parked inside, like a house, inside your garage, it's okay. If you park it out in the sun, at least during much of the year, it's effing hot when you get in your car and you turn your air conditioning on, blast in your car. Now, if you're parked in a multi-level structure parking, so you're in shade, it's maybe not effing hot, it's just hot. You get in your car, you may have to drive long enough to get your car inside cooled, but you get it cooled. You go park somewhere, and then you get out in the effing hot temperature, and you walk into wonderful air conditioning. Now, I know it's sort of like that in places in the South too, but I've not visited there as much as Vegas. So in Vegas, you're going to have a normal work day, and either you're going to work in effing hot conditions, outdoor construction or something like that, or you're going to work in wonderful air conditioned conditions, and then so the outside temperature, weather doesn't matter because you're doing whatever, and it's inside you're air conditioned. So siesta time is not a thing to concern yourself. So cultures can be different because of different conditions that they exist in, and it does show us different, if you will, laboratories, experiments, comparative elements of the way humanity can do things. Sometimes it can show you the things in very bad forms. Those guys built lots of tanks, and they're now driving them into our country. Kind of, yeah, we're better. We knew how to build. We built tanks and more tanks and more tanks, and we're driving into your country. And boy, it's nice here. We'll take yours as well as ours. Or ours was really fucked up and cold. And man, you've got a nice Mediterranean beach down here. We're moving down here with our tanks. Whatever, sometimes it can show up as a bad symptom, being that they're different things. But otherwise, if you can maintain peace and stability, if you can, we'll see how humanity does that, if well or badly or something. That again is part of the internationalist viewpoint. That's why they don't like nationalism. But the internationalist going to need to drive tanks into your country to force you to become part of their international empire. And we're going, in my opinion, we're going to see either the EU, not that the EU is ever, that's too long, is in the next, say, 50 years, is ever going to fully disappear. But I think we're going to see more and more areas, for one reason or another, opt out of the EU, whether it is, just based on sort of nationalistic, or which can also be regional, things that don't make sense for being part of the EU. They're going to leave because of centralization. When it was still the European Common Market, or the EC, or some sort of more nebulous thing, sort of like the UN. See, if the difference between the UN, United Nations, they do have, but United is different than Union. Now we have the United States of America, yes, but that, as described during particularly the American Civil War, the Union versus the European Union, it is a union. It is not like United Nations, which is definitely spelling out more nations. But United Nations, sort of at its core, its rules are supposed to be governing interaction between nations. And really the only time EU law actually sort of gets into nations is when they actually go to war with each other. Then you have various, wartime, war crimes or whatever kind of violations. But really it's meant, the United Nations, was not meant so that the world voted on what government the Soviet Union was, or what kind of economic system the Soviet Union was going to have, or what kind of economic system the U.S. is going to have. It was set up, at least in my understanding, expressly to govern international relations between nations, not govern them internally, where the EU and the United States of America and the United Kingdom, or United Kingdoms of Britain, are meant to govern, to set up rules that enforce, because we have their constitution in the United States, even though we have regional governments, but enforce how they internally govern themselves. So if the EU had stayed out of any regulations that were domestic and only governed interrelations, between the EU members, that would have worked, could have worked, as well as that type of thing could work. And so that you might have a, we'll go with Charles de Gaulle dictatorship, of Charles de Gaulle, Emperor of France, and put up a fence around France to either keep people out or keep people in or whatever they do, and have that sort of hardcore de Gaulle France. But they don't get to change their boundaries because it's all part of the EU, so that can't be a nationalism that gets to, expand into French-speaking Belgian areas or French-speaking Swiss areas. I know I sort of ended this. Swiss areas or something like that. Just France. But, they get to do their own thing, and there's no regulations that within the EU that would stop their, growing certain plants or having certain regulations. It was just purely an national relations kind of thing. It might have worked better, but I think it's going to spin out. Now, there may be a rump state of the EU with places like Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, France, that are culturally similar enough that will stick together, while, places like Greece and maybe, Portugal or something might spin off, or Italy might spin off. I think there's more of an Lexit going on than some of these other places. So I don't think the EU can stand unless it's going to be willing to put tanks, like the Warsaw Pact was willing to put tanks into Prague, tanks into Warsaw, to hold the Warsaw Pact together. Unless it's willing to do that, I don't think it can hold it together, because that is the difference between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Sure, Germany, France, Britain, and the United States had absolute rights to, at least in their regions, to put tanks on the streets of Germany, but that was exclusively because of German behavior in 2 world wars. It was not, when France basically for a while under de Gaulle opted out of active participation in NATO for various reasons, mostly just being French. None of the NATO partners even considered, moving tanks into France. It was a defensive alignment that, and France is converted over, but that some of its few insistence upon is having the same caliber of weapons, all 9mm pistols, all 5.56 and 7.62 NATO ammunition, and they'll accept the 50 cal because no one else has come up with anything better at that caliber. And so you have to come to certain minimal agreements, but Eurofighter projects are sort of more voluntary and often fall apart, or Euro tank projects or whatever that are sometimes more political than otherwise, but they're still voluntary. So yeah, nationalism is good, positive thing for humanity, necessary for humanity to flourish properly. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, please subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you give, intelligent reasons why you think I'm wrong about either some point or the overall hypothesis that nationalism is good, please post your comments below. See you next time for actual historical gaming videos.